revolving around this, I guess, short series is advocating the role of the architect, I guess, in the humanitarian sector in architecture, and how the humanitarian sector, or the term humanitarian architecture, has evolved, I guess, over time, and is really pivotal in terms of relief construction for disaster zones and natural disasters. So I would like to introduce David Anderson from Architects Without Frontiers. David is a senior architect and was a director of Architects Without Frontiers from 2008 to 2012, with 18 years industry experience in residential, commercial and humanitarian architecture. He's got 10 years community development, design and construction experience in Nepal, leading teams of architects and architecture students to related construction professionals to Nepal to undertake community development projects. So I'll leave us with David.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'm certainly pleased to be able to speak to you all this afternoon, and really thanks Estelle for the invite. Every opportunity I can get to be able to wave the flag for humanitarian architecture, I take it, because I think it's an incredibly important field. Architects are incredibly underrepresented in the disaster relief sector, unfortunately, and we've got so much architects have got so much we can give. And just to place a definition of humanitarian architecture, if you can define it at all, and I don't like simplifying these things, but working with the people, community in need, to understand and provide an architectural solution to meet a need. And now the work may vary from a very small community development project at one end of the scale right up to a large humanitarian crisis at the other end of the scale, and all in between. And two examples here. We have a project that we did in Bulbule a few years ago, right up to the refugee camp. Still requiring planning. Refugee camps still require planning and set out, and I'll talk about that shortly. What is the developing world? I like to put this graphic up at the start of my at any lecture, because it really helps to paint a picture of really 80% of the world's population live in the developing world, so that we're so fortunate with the conditions that we have here in Australia compared to 80% of the world. That's a really interesting growth. Kind of hits home sort of scale that we're faced with, and to bring that again into light, we see over 38 million people are now currently displaced worldwide, and without access to adequate shelter. And what that means is not only due to war, environmental conditions, internal conflict as well. There's a lot of internally displaced people, as has been evidenced in what you've been seeing on the news broadcasts recently. Just quickly, the basic human needs, just to if I can just frame what I'm just about to talk about in this light, we can see the basic psychological needs that we've got: air, food, drink, shelter right down the bottom. And what that means is that as architects, we can provide architectural solutions to meet the need for shelter, and do it really well and really sensitively. And I've got this image here, which is a new camp recently constructed for the Syrian refugees in Jordan. You just have to look at what's been placed here to understand that there are better ways of doing this. There are better ways of, like one of these little shelters. Can you imagine living in one of those in the middle of the Jordanian desert in hot conditions? It'd be like a little microwave. They're often referred to as little microwave ovens, because they would be. And there are better ways of doing disaster relief and humanitarian architecture. Okay, role of the architect in the humanitarian sector. I've just listed a few, just a handful of items here, a handful of skill sets that architects can bring, like coordination roles. We've been involved recently in the earthquake relief in Nepal, and I'll talk about that shortly. We've identified a small village in one region of the Gorkha region, which was just below the epicentre, and a lot of that simply requires coordination roles. And as architects, we are good at coordinating various consultants and a whole lot of various stake players, and that can fall into, and that can help assist in coordinating the work that you need to do when a disaster hits. Planning pre-disaster and post-disaster, planning through the UN cluster system. I'll talk about that shortly. Refugee camp planning is an incredibly growing field where architects have got so much that we can input. Quite often that planning has been done by civil engineers and by even mechanical engineers, and architects can bring so much to the plate in terms of site planning, master planning, understanding way communities develop and communities gather. Pro bono architecture services, and also design and construct projects. And I've got a few examples here. Work of Shigeru Ban up the top there, the Yanganwadi project that AWF run in conjunction with Bureau, and also a refugee camp. So just to quickly go back, the UN cluster system is how when a disaster hits, the UN cluster system usually kicks into place, and that's been happening in Nepal recently. When we've been wanting to go into work in the Gorkha region and in the village that we've identified, we have to fall within the cluster system. So when we got there, you're identifying the cluster lead for shelter, identifying the local NGOs who are working on ground, hooking up with those, forming those partnerships, getting the various permissions then to be able to do the work. Incredibly important. Okay, just to quickly talk about what we've been doing in regard to the earthquake response. 2 earthquakes recently in Nepal, one on the 25th of April and a secondary one on the 12th of May. And there's just some statistics up the top there. Over 8 million people affected as a result of the 25th of April earthquake, and then further people affected in the 12th of May. And what we see is over 600,000 homes destroyed. These are government statistics, and 7,000 schools damaged and destroyed. A lot of these areas through here received the majority of the damage. Kathmandu was only damaged about 40%, and a lot of that damage happened around the historical areas. 3 stages of a disaster response, and this leads into what I'm just about to talk about with regard to our earthquake response. We see rescue, relief and recovery. The rescue being the initial immediate response, relief being the short-term focus on safe and temporary shelter. So at the moment we're kind of moving and morphing into this area here in Nepal. Still rescue's been done, relief is nearly out of the way, although these kind of blur. They blur so much from relief into recovery. At the moment the shelter cluster has identified a program called the winterisation program for Nepal. Terrible word, but what that basically means is improving the temporary shelters that the locals have constructed for themselves. Quite often they're literally a tarp and a bit of corrugated iron sheet, and that has formed the basis of the majority of the temporary shelters in some of the outer rural areas. And the shelter cluster is now providing a program whereby those temporary shelters will be improved, from simple things as raising the beds off the floor by putting some platforms for the beds, to providing some more suitable wall coverings rather than just simply a tarp to ride out the winter, the forthcoming winter, and also making sure that there's warmth within those temporary shelters. And so the government has said that the more permanent shelters, they're wanting to see a 2-year turnaround before that starts to kick in, although the locals are really starting to build those now. UN cluster systems I talked about before. With regard to disaster relief, the various aspects of the disaster are divided up into various clusters. There's ideally a humanitarian coordinator which coordinates all the various clusters. No system is perfect, but this is a hell of a lot better than what it used to be. And with regard to shelter, the International Red Cross Red Crescent are responsible for shelter in a non-refugee environment. In a refugee environment, UNHCR take over that role. Okay, what we've identified with regard to the work that we'll be doing with respect to earthquake recovery, we've identified region of Gorka. Normally for the past 10 years we've been going into the Lamjung region, which is where the Annapurnas are, to do community development projects, taking students and architects in to undertake that work. And having been doing that for the past 10 years, we had a really lot of good connections on ground. So when the disaster hit, we were able to immediately mobilise those connections and then plug in. Identified the region of Gorka, which was one of the most destroyed regions, but some of our Nepali staff have family there, so we identified that as a region. One of the new NGOs which we've been doing work with now, called Heads Nepal, health, education, agriculture, Nepal, do work in the Bagua region, so we identified that region. And now we've identified a village called Rithapani, which requires complete relocation. The land is unsuitable for the village to remain there long term, and they've identified land in conjunction with the Village Development Committee and the District Development Committee to be able to now move the village, and that's a long-term project and long-term focus. So we set up camp there for about a week, and then identified some of the work that we'll be doing. So we met with the OCHA representative in the field and providing that feedback. Here we go. Here's an image of one of the temporary shelters that one of the locals set up for himself. Just a simple bamboo frame, some corrugated iron salvaged, and a tarp out the back. So, and there's the village of Rithapani that will require relocating. So we're constantly providing feedback to the shelter cluster. We met with SONA, which is the Society of Nepalese Architects, not your student organisation of representatives, but SONA are kind of like our institute. So they're the Society of Nepalese Architects. Architects Sans Frontières Nepal and EWB Nepal, we met with those guys to form those partnerships, and then work. Get ideas for more permanent shelter, but that's a long way down the track. There's a lot of work that's been done in Nepal and on the ground with regard to designing how do you design an earthquake-resistant home in rural Nepal? How do you go about that? And there's all these questions that have been asked and answered. This is the sort of work we'll be doing. All the temporary shelter is now up, so we'll be working with the winterisation program now. We've funded some construction of some temporary learning centres. We're going to be working on ground to replan the relocation of the village, work alongside the village representatives, and look at they're really open to some really good models of how that can work. And a long-term project, which will probably happen next year, will be designing and constructing a community centre. So we're looking in the village, been receptive to this as a sort of community hub of a school community centre, and then the village forming around that, but that's also likely to change as well. So just some quick images. This is typical of one of the homes in the Bagua region and Gorka. Really unliving, unsuitable. 90% of the homes just simply destroyed. This was a school, and there's been talk and discussion about common issues and common issues being faced with regard to the destruction of the homes, and they're kind of thinking that over the years some of the techniques that their forefathers had of actually tying some of the structure into each other has kind of been lost, but the government's sort of looking at all those things. There's been ideas been floated of a Gabion house, but that may or may not take place. What will more than likely happen is that the homes will be rebuilt the way they were. Unfortunately, but the government has a 2-year rollout. They're wanting people to hold off for a while before they rebuild their homes. But that's even when we were there, the residents were piling up their stones quite neatly, all ready to rebuild again. Okay, and this is just a quick snapshot of the village of Rithapani, what it'll cost. We've done some number crunching, and And so this will be some of the costs involved of relocating the village. I just thought I'd put that up as a bit of a matter of interest of costs associated in Australia versus costs associated in Nepal. And yeah, so we're looking at 90 homes, 3 temples, community centre hub with school and water supply and electricity. Okay, just to move on again to disaster response. You may or may not have heard of the Sphere project. In any disaster relief, the Sphere project kicks into place. It's kind of like the minimum standards for humanitarian response, and that is utilised not only in refugee camp planning, but also in for example, non-food item distribution, and also some of the distributions that we're involved with our local NGO up there. Again, all refers back to Sphere. Just some images of non-food item distribution, and that's typically what that involves up the top there. The UNHCR also have some really good guidelines in terms of humanitarian response, and the handy guide, all downloadable, really good reference in terms of just basic minimum standards. Just some fun facts which I pulled out of the Sphere in terms of refugee camp planning. This is a refugee camp in Somalia. You can see how it kind of works in terms of this layering of family, community, sector, camp module, and then up to camp. And all this is usually required. There's you can see how this camp has been laid out with roads and land breaks and little hubs and latrines in there. And there's a zoom in up the top. And there's just a blow-up image of that. You can really see the layering that's involved there. Further considerations to consider in terms of camp planning. Again, you can really see how architectural skills can be utilised in this. Just that those master planning skills that you learn and you develop over years, really useful. And there's so many things that can be done a lot better. There's things to consider from landmine clearing to road access to tribal antagonisms. You don't want to put tribe X next to tribe Y if they're going to eat each other, and so forth. And unaccompanied females is a huge issue, and again, Sphere deals with all of that. Images of the Zatari refugee camp. You can see over the years how it's worked, and you can really see the visible layering of the family, community, sector, camp module. And there's just some further images there of the various refugee camps, and again you can see. Not the best sort of, again, I keep on harping back to this, but not the best sort of solution for displaced persons to live in. An architectural solution. Refugee camp in Kyrgyzstan. These images, this is available. These books you can see in Design Like You Give a Damn. I hope it is available in your library. You can see this in there. Really great response. Unfortunately, this doesn't exist anymore. It was removed because it was deemed to be too permanent, which is really unfortunate, because what a great response in terms of just the comfort and living compared to those little microwave ovens which I showed you earlier.
David, could you elaborate on that process of you, or the organisation AWF in general, going into these zones with their knowledge of the construction process here, and then engaging with the locals over there? Like this one, for example, looks like there's more engagement.
Yeah, this is certainly not an AWF project, but yeah, there is that definitely need for community engagement, and
liaising with local builders.
Yeah.
In comparison to just bringing over completely external construction methods.
Yeah, that's right. Great question, because I'll answer all that now in these community development projects. Community development is another way that architects can be involved in work, and this is work that I'm involved with in Nepal, from community engagement, to really we head over in the middle of the year for, and I'll wrap up shortly, in the middle of the year for a couple of weeks. We meet with the village representatives who work out what their need is. We do a bit of a return brief through our Nepali staff over there, a bit of a design process, and then at the end of the year we go and build it. But so there is that constant community engagement. For example, with the school that we built in Goshinkali, from the initial meeting to the completion of the school, these guys wanted to do a completely flat, volume builder response, a bang bang, and we convinced them to climb the school up the site. So for a small intervention, but a great response. But that community engagement is so important because the community needs to own the project. We're not just coming in with and then building something and going out. There is that constant interaction and construction with the community. The community have a sense of ownership. They provide some small materials, a little bit of funding or whatever, but there is that constant engagement. So just skip past that. But in the light of that, with the work that we do in Nepal is within the context of our trips that we run at the end of the year. 4 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks worth of construction, and just quickly speed up now. So in just a quick snapshot of some projects. In 2006 and 2007 we built a toilet and shower for the community. Again, the community use this facility when they have festivals in this particular field, so it's used by us at the end of the year but used by the community throughout the year. Just quickly move up to this one here. In 2013 and 14 we brought 2 groups of University of Adelaide students over who undertook this trip as part of their degree. We constructed 2 mothers groups halls for the village of Cootee South and of Tar. I met with the village representatives of the mothers group in the middle of the year, got an understanding of what they wanted from their mothers group training hall. We then went back, had some design shoots at Adelaide Uni, then came back and built the facility with them at the end of the year. And we employed local staff, we employed local tradesmen, and the students that come along funded the construction and bought the materials, again from the local community, so constantly feeding back into the community. So this is a bit more of a modern method for this area of Nepal, being concrete blockwork, but it's a lot of the homes are built out of, sorry, not homes, a lot of the facilities are built out of this now. We'd like to do some work with Meme Architecture, who do some work in Nepal using more of a traditional method, bamboo and some mud brick to do some schools. Great responses. This is a real quick method of doing it. We'd like to work a little bit more developing some of those techniques, but with some of the schools and kindergartens we've built over the years, local drywall techniques. This is a blockwork, but still that knowledge sharing taking place of teaching the locals how to do engaged peers while they're teaching us how to do a lot of other stuff as well. And this was how we left it at the end of the 3 weeks worth of construction, and then just wait for a sec before I get up to that. Then the community finished it off. So we brought it so far. Then the community completed the project. So it was a really good response through that community engagement, engaging with the locals, finding out what they want, and meeting that need. Just quickly. Project that we did here, which I'm really excited about. This was the first project that we did for a group called Mighty Nepal. Mighty Nepal are an NGO in Nepal that rescue girls from trafficking and sexual slavery. This is one of their transit homes way down south east Nepal, and we rebuilt the toilet and shower facilities for them. They were in a really bad state of disrepair, and again, so what we can see now is 2 into the scale, from a large school to a large mothers group hall to a small, incredibly beautiful intervention of just going in and rebuilding some toilet facilities. So something small but incredibly important. And so now we'll be doing work with Mighty every year. One group will be going to do work with them. So at the end of this year we'll do work in their hospice by building another little shower enclosure for the girls who have come out of that really terrible scene. And yeah, so that's there. We've done work in Pashupatinath Hospice, where we rebuilt a roof for the hospice. That's in the Pashupatinath temple site, which is the most holy temple site in Nepal. And now the Pashupatinath Trust are wanting us to do some more work there, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, the monkeys are eating the silicon. So if anyone knows how to stop monkeys eat silicon, let me know. And last year, just we did some more work in Sarung. We've been going back to Sarung for a long time now, and we replaced the roof on the school for them. And again, small intervention, but incredibly important for the school. But again, and that came out through developing the relationship with these areas for the past 10 years. We're approached by the village. They get an idea of we get an understanding of what their need is, and then we meet that need. So as I referred back at the start, an architectural solution to meet a need, and that can be from one end of the scale, your major humanitarian crisis being the refugee camp, which there are incredibly good ways to plan those, through to a very small community development project. For example, one of the other small things we do when we are faced with an existing school, we'll put one sheet of transparent roof sheet in each classroom to allow natural light to come into the classroom, because a lot of the existing rural schools are literally just a concrete block extrusion, and but there are other ways of doing things. So just quickly, as work will be in the plug, please get in before I hand over, get in touch with me. Yeah, there's my email address now. We're kind of pretty well, we've got 4 groups. We've got 4 groups going over in December, January of architecture students, some from UTS and some from, unis all over Australia, as well as practicing architects. We'll be having one group in Lamjung that we've always been going to for the past 10 years to maintain that association with Lamjung, to do they had some minor damage with regard to the earthquake, because everything was kind of from the ridge that way and there that way. And so we'll be doing some more work in Lamjung. Two groups will be in Gorkha doing some earthquake relief, and another group will hopefully be in Satigata working on the Meiji hospice. But again, just to reinforce with regard to community development, with regard to the work that we do, there is that constant engagement with the community, building up those relationships, building up those, so you can go in there. So the idea being so that when we go in and we help the community, working alongside the community, then when we leave, they can say that they did it by themselves. It's not about us. It's not about us doing the work. It's all about the community development, the community engagement.
Or they're at least educated in terms of...
Oh, certainly there's this... On site, there's this beautiful knowledge sharing that takes place.
So is that what the students are involved in, both the construction,
the
physical work, and the social?
Yeah. There's when we're there for the 2 to 3 weeks building, we set up tent in the village. We live in the village. We become part of the village, and then there's on site. For example, with the school, with the work that we do, we'll put a polythene barrier down to stop rising damp. It doesn't normally happen in the rural areas, but there's just that small intervention, that knowledge sharing that takes place. If we're building out a block work, we'll teach the locals to do engaged peers, something that they're not used to, because block work is relatively new. If we're building out of drywall, again, polythene barrier up, and we make sure there's that tie-in, so that the to make it more stable. But then again, they're teaching us drywall. They're teaching us how to be patient with regard to with regard to construction. Things just happen in Nepali time. Yeah. Okay. Handball.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dave.
No worries.
Just to make the link to the previous discussion, so basically you need physical access. So overall, wherever you do development of humanitarian assistance, space. It's physical space to start with. And to do anything, to build anything, you need to be able to gain access to the space to create something. So, and the people that are there, you need to have access. So it's good to have this community engagement. However, if then you start working in countries where the space decreases, You can have something like that in Afghanistan, where the risk levels are substantially high and extreme. So you basically can see that the only safe area for access are some of the white ones. And trust me, they may not necessarily be that safe anymore to gain access to it. And that's where it becomes then quite very much the question, what do you do in this? And that's when most humanitarians go down and do basic survival needs, which is the Maslow's scale model. They certainly wouldn't be building anything. But the reason, and before I go into some of the peace architecture ideas, the reason why often we get that way is because reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction, works in a context they don't actually understand, or because ideas get mixed in the end. And since we had construction example, I can give you an example from shelter construction in Afghanistan and elsewhere. There's a quite famous example that's been used in training for do no harm in Tajikistan, where there was reconstruction after conflict. And that's why it's different to have reconstruction after conflict versus reconstruction after natural disaster. Because conflict means that there was, of course, conflict between groups beforehand. And once you have, in terms of refugees, in the sense of not environmental disaster displacement, you will also have had conflict. So there was a conflict, there was reconstruction, and that actually exacerbated conflict because the houses that were being rebuilt, which was a shelter program, through food for work programs, were only by one ethnic group. Of course, their houses were the most destroyed, which didn't mean that there was no need in the other. And this is something that in most conflict zones you deal with. That of course, if there were aggressors and victims, and often the victims of course need the most assistance, it doesn't mean that the aggressors were all, one group was all the aggressors. It may just be that certain militias were the aggressors, but it doesn't mean that that group doesn't have any assistance. In that particular case, there were also houses that were destroyed, so there's something that if you know the context and you understand that if there's a source of tension between two groups, that you potentially should look into involving that other group in the reconstruction. And that means that in your project, in the community engagement, that you may have to reach out of the very community you build in, because if villages, which they often are mono-ethnic, it is fine if you then reconstruct there. It doesn't mean that the village over, which might be a different ethnic or tribal group, that also maybe have a need for assistance, then doesn't get jealous. And that happened in Afghanistan largely because also what's now so conflicted is the South, which is where most of the military was. And with the military went development spending. And with development spending also went then, of course, the part that who wanted to control that spending and who wanted to have that reconstruction control. And that goes to the point that you construct a road, which by development purposes or humanitarian purposes is very crucial because it gives you access. However, if then there's insecurity and then certain militias control the road, you actually start to legitimize and empower these very militias by paying them access on that very road. That's the same question in Somalia, for example, when 80% of humanitarian aid went to militias. And then the UN will tell you that always something will go amiss, and that's your price that you're paying. But the question is how much, you have to make a judgment call, how much is it then worth it? If it's only 20% of all your aid that goes into it, if it's the road that gets controlled and you keep feeding in basically a suppressive machinery that suppresses the people locally. Roads are very tricky in conflict situations because they don't just bring assistance or aid, they largely bring military and fighters. So most resistance groups don't like road construction. That's one of the things they target. It's also very logistic issue. It's much harder to mine a road that's paved than to mine a road that's not paved. It's much easier to bury a landmine in it. But I talked to Andrea about the example. It can be where you put a hospital. Even if a hospital is a good thing, but it depends if it only serves part of the community, if the access is only to part of the community, it could be jealousy. It could be even how you use the hospital for, and I'm not sure how much because Afghanistan drowns out of the news, it's even the issue what happened in Kunduz with MSF, where they were having a hospital. And of course there was a claim by the Afghan government, they will still stick to, that the hospital was being used to shelter by insurgents. You could go into the humanitarian imperative, etc., that even then they shouldn't have bombed it, but they did bomb it. They bombed it for over 30 minutes. And that's the most recent one. That's the very recent one, yeah. But this is, for example, that if you function that space, even if you create a physical structure, you no longer function outside the social infrastructure around you. And a lot of what you do with your work can actually do harm. And I can give you small examples, and they all are linked to architectural solutions, I would say, or at least construction solutions. We've looked in communities where people go in and they consult with the communities, but the question comes who you consult with in the communities. Often you consult with certain elements within the communities, but they also have interests. And then it comes down to power and the agencies. And we have seen retaining walls being built. Retaining walls are for flooding, that protect fields, that basically only protect the areas of a commander. Because that's who the people that consulted had the access to, or that's the person that had the most power and can push their project ahead. And in the worst case scenario, it doesn't just protect that particular person's pastures, but it also increases the flooding in the rest of the community, which of course creates the tensions in it. And then you have to go in necessarily and to fix that by building other retaining walls to protect from the first initial construct. And that's how, and I say unintentionally and inadvertently, good architectural solutions can create conflict. And that's why I was quite happy to hear that you start looking in, design of refugee camps, how you put groups together. What you will not solve is if the refugee camp starts hosting rebel groups. And they have. And that was in the DRC. It was a classic example that an Australian Fiona Terry wrote a good book about. It could attempt to repeat is this whole question about humanitarianism. Should you then just leave? Should you leave in a context where you cannot no longer actually maintain the humanitarian imperative in that? Because you could say that you're coming in there for independence, neutrality, humanity, you're helping communities, but in the end, if there are rebel groups there, if people see you associated, even by default, even if you don't do it intentionally, with one of the groups, you lost that neutrality. And that's why I always be very, very careful in these contexts to talk about it. Because conflicts don't necessarily just deteriorate for nothing. They tend to deteriorate because certain things are not being looked about. And one of the biggest problems in Afghanistan was the linking with military and humanitarian or even development aid. By having something like the provincial reconstruction teams, which Australia had one in Uruzgan. Do you want to know where Uruzgan is on here?
Show us where Bagram and Uruzgan and Kabul is.
Kabul is here.
Yeah.
This is the south. So this is Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan is in here. It's a landlocked area. So you see that there's even a black part into it. And that was, because largely what the Australians did, they worked with, at that point, the political establishment. And that is the problem when you have a state building project. And even if you then say you're coming in with the best intentions, to assist the country, then it is up to who you work with and who controls the state. That's the social infrastructure and the power. And if those people are less interested in actually building peace, rather than maybe building their own power base, you can have started a problem. And then it comes to basically resource distribution. Who owns, who doesn't own, who is included, who is excluded. And unless you know really, really well the communities, that's very, very hard to avoid unless you've done a very thorough and, assessment before that. Because in the end, you can legitimize actors which are bad. The governors of Uruzgan and much of the south were used to be human rights violation. One of them were the recent one that the Australian government worked with in terms of capacity building before they left. Wasn't even allowed to run for elections because the UN had put him on a blacklist because he was basically controlled the drug trade in the south, and he used to have private prisons. When confronted, they would say, well, yeah, but the government appointed him. We are here to support the government, and we are here to provide governance. And then you build houses, you construct and govern buildings, you build the walls around it, you increase, of course, the security. But you can question whether it's the best thing. The Australians also, for example, built a prison. And their argument was, look, that will increase justice. I would question whether building physically a prison building will improve governance and justice, just because you have better accommodation for the prisoners to be locked up in, if you cannot control the system of whether people are rightfully or wrongfully imprisoned, or whether people end up in prison because they're from, a political opposition group, etc. Then it could be quite dangerous if you provide, a construction of a prison in something. And that is something that we look, in my work, I've looked more into, of course, the fact that when you do a lot of this physical, but also money, which is all resource reconstruction, to have it at least do it what we call a context, a conflict-sensitive way, and consider the social infrastructure around it. And one of the new things, of course, that with physical infrastructure comes what is now considered peace infrastructure or peace architecture, which is basically that you need institutions that can help people to find a peaceful future. And this is Ban Ki-moon, although in peace building, in peace studies, this has been put forth by scholars much sooner, but it's become quite, a hot term more recently, is this peace architecture, which borrows in many ways, and I show you from probably architectural principles that you have. Because the point is that peace, and I always say I know what I'm talking about, I'm German, I'm originally German, and Germany of course is a country that's come out of two wars, and Germany is also a country where architecture was used to intimidate. That was what all Hitler did. I would encourage anybody that wants to actually look at this idea of infrastructure for intimidation. In Nuremberg, where the Reichstags work, there's a very good museum now within the old Reichstag, which was built as the Colosseum, that talks about this, how Hitler used that infrastructure to intimidate, but also to build his power, even why he picked Nuremberg, which was an imperial city, so historically and everything. So, but it also is to understand that just as infrastructure, in my opinion, or architecture could be used to support war, it could be used to support peace, but you need to also then have the principal ideas. You need people to have a vision. Just like, as you said, you need to have a vision how to build a better building, a building that actually suits people better, or a city that suits people better. You need people that can imagine an infrastructure or institutions that suit their country better, and that needs to go hand in hand with the physical reconstruction to not make sure that the physical reconstruction in the end actually serves the people that oppress, the people that actually then violate human rights, etc. Inadvertently, most of the things are unintentionally. In the do no harm, conflict-sensitive approach, we say that harm is mostly done unintentionally because context is not fully understood, or because you said, well, no, I'm not getting involved. What I'm doing is the basic needs approach, not understanding that needs in these contexts can be highly politically and certainly no longer neutral or impartial. And also then having the openness, and that's part of the problem in these countries, that peace can look different ways. As you just said, we could construct a refugee camp that way, we could do it differently, but often we do this blueprint approach, and interestingly enough, post-conflict peace building has this idea of the liberal peace that you have to reconstruct a lot of the countries around, of course, the ideal state, the barbarian state. And that often, you don't even imagine alternatives of how a country, a governance structure that could help that country could look like. And that is part of the problem. Why often we then fail is because we basically provide an architecture that doesn't serve the context in it. You can see it physically or not, as you say, and then you create, I guess, a bad city, that is bad for the people that live into it, so. And this is the guiding principle of peace infrastructure. Luc Rechler, who's a very much thinker in that area, is of course you need to have what peace looks like for you, and often we have two basic definitions: negative peace, which is the absence of war, or positive peace, which requires a lot more actually of governance, human rights, inclusion, principles, etc. Too often in the liberal peace you go simply for the negative peace, which is the absence of war. The positive peace is the link to development. You need to have that understanding of the context, what will or will not work in the context, what should or should we not do in the context, what if I do in this context potentially will actually backlash. Then you need to have the peace plans, but you also then need to have implementation, and you basically need to have people that can be these visionaries, which become the peace architects of that structure, that actually want to create peace rather than people that just want to empower themselves. And too often in these contexts we end up working with people that simply want to rule and power by all means necessary, and of course have an interest to control resources that you bring. And resources can be money, development assistance, they can also be controlling buildings. It is quite amazing how often buildings are being built because people want to impose. A governor gets a good governor's office, not necessarily rewarding good governance, but showing that this is where the governor sits. Then you build a wall around it, you make the access very difficult, which of course then divides them from the rest of the people. So, and of course inhibit the walls that prevent peace, which is of course more on the human side, what keeps people separate, etc. So while it is probably very good in a refugee camp not to put rivaling tribes next to each other, you probably may want to think of an infrastructure within that camp where you can bring people together to start a reconciliation process as well, because if you don't start it soon enough, you just, encourage the separation more than anything. So I think that's how the social with the physical need to go together, in my opinion, in the thinking. And I think there could be probably a lot more cross-fertilization between the terms, not just us picking up, languages from design and architecture. So, and the newest term is I4P, Infrastructures for Peace. It is partially to sell local efforts into what we could say the liberal peace idea. It's also the idea to give peace an address, a physical address. It is also talked about giving a space, a house for people to meet, to discuss peace. So there's always this idea that you physically need to essentially, as Hitler, for example, tried to have this architecture to impose and to threaten, that you start to have architecture that emphasizes that this is a space where we will not fight. This is a space where we will actually discuss. Which is thinking of the famous, this is the war. Let's not fight in the war room from How I Got to Love the Bomb, Dr. Strangelove. So let's not fight in the war room. Let's have a peace room for it. So, but here, and that's where again they borrow probably from architecture, or at least design, is that you have the ability that you link these small localized efforts somehow together into a larger infrastructure that can then bring peace on a larger level. Because in a context like that, it's very, very hard to do anything at national level. And you can have these national level peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but the question is that the Afghan government has no legitimacy, which frankly it doesn't, because it has included warlords, it doesn't provide governance, it's highly corrupt, etc. So basically controls resources, sits in nice buildings, but doesn't provide that social fabric that you need for a country to function, where people can trust it. But there are many of these other potential infrastructures or councils that are not physically existing, but meet in many places, and often that's how they look like. And I can give you many ones. It's basically the idea of the circle courts that you have from the Aboriginal communities. Often, the problem with these structures is that they're male only, so there's issues of inclusion that you can work on. And one of the organizations in Afghanistan that actually helped create in 2003 and have been working with since then was the liaison office. Liaison being liaison between different structures, and was trying to actually find a role for these traditional structures in the more modern architecture of the state in Afghanistan. I wouldn't say that we haven't been all that successful in some of it. There have been some interesting lessons out of it. But we also have looked in trying to make the existing structures more inclusive by bringing women into these structures. And TILO still exists. For a while they were doing a lot of context assessments, and right now they're doing a lot more actually with displacement, because displacement is higher. They're working in displacement camps, although officially there are no IDP camps really in Afghanistan. They're informal settlements. Which in my opinion, if we don't assist them, we shouldn't be surprised if you're going to see something similar to what's happening in Syria out of Afghanistan. So it's just a bit harder to make it across, but there's also Afghans coming into it, because there's literally, in that urban planning, Kabul was never set up to have that many people coming into the city. And then you can come in and use the language of, well, you're an economic refugee, you're a displaced person, you're displaced from violence, the most displacement is mixed. They're coming in informal settlements, which have literally often not even permanent. I've done studies in that they have not even permanent shelters in there. You could do it because you're in a city context and you're non-camp context actually. But then you run into the problem that often they're settling outside cities next to roads, which is very valuable property, and there have been examples of shelters being built. The moment you actually have the permanent shelters, other people come in and infringe and grab it because it's more valuable than tents, which is another reason why UNHCR is sometimes very cautious to not build permanent structure or provide all that permanent other infrastructure like water sanitation, is because it makes something more valuable. And in a context where there is a lot of poverty, and then if the people that get assistance are the most vulnerable and are not even from the area, it can be recaptured by people that already have been living there, because you build something for them that's better than the host communities. So I've worked with NRC, for example, in trying to get that understanding. Norwegian Refugee Council, they do a lot of shelter, is that you always need to also work with the host community, at least with the most vulnerable in the host community, not be seen to just, aid one, which we call a distribution effect, that you only work with one of the community and your resources go in one for it. And then there is another question that I've discussed a lot with it, is that, of course, post-conflict conflict, other than it gets this crazy, uncontrolled construction, often gets constructions which are what we would call, under conflict sensitivity, symbols of war. These are squares that are dedicated to militia commanders. This is Ahmad Shah Massoud, which you probably heard about in Kabul. That's also close to the US Embassy. That's the site of many IEDs, probably because it's close to the US Embassy, which is here, but also because of who that square embodies. And this is Mazari in the West. He was a Western warlord, and I've discussed with many Afghans that what often is lacking, that might be something for architecture to think, is physical symbols of peace. These are symbols of war. And then the question is, why these squares, which are quite in Afghanistan, they like this roundabout traffic as well, why these squares always get dedicated to militia commanders. It's as if you have all, military squares. And that is something where I think, for example, in Germany, where they've tried to deal with the past, it is like, do you reconstruct the church, or do you keep it as a memory of the war? How do you deal with buildings that Hitler inhabited? I think where the bunker is, they basically just made a mundane. I think they just paved it over. Or do you actually then have a Holocaust memorial in a space to remember of the destructions of war? Or do you glorify that basically fighting is the way to go after conflict? You reward the people that gained power through means of violence. And that's something that I found quite interesting. Might be nice to think about how one can help cities to create essentially symbols of peace through architecture. Because most squares in most Afghan cities are symbols of war. Well, or let's say glorification of war. So, and that just shows a society where you don't really have yet a very solid infrastructure of peace, because it hasn't been reinforced. Okay.
Well, maybe, Andrea, maybe you could comment on what Suzanne...
do we need to put this in? I don't know whether you
I'll put this in the centre, I guess. What Suzanne was talking about in terms of the social construct behind all these projects, and what you think is relevant
I agree with
from
everything
that.
she said.
Yeah, in terms of temporary relief response and that in comparison to the long term, and how the social contracts ties into it.
I left Architects Without Frontiers because I did feel that this issue is much more important, especially because it is just going in and doing a little bit of clean up in the village or whatever, even if it's a disaster, is not just because it's not allowed. Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry, that's the other.
Okay.
Sorry, I just passed one on.
Well, it was just that I felt we emergency architects really just dealt with emergencies, but that's when you galvanise both international support from larger agencies. You also galvanise, you're going into a situation where there is no other alternative often. And after being in Afghanistan earlier, the problems that we had with the hospital was where we did community consultation, but with the women. A man actually controls whether a woman can get access to a hospital or not in birth. We also had the problem of accessibility because they still were on camels. I mean, these poor women were coming in, and also the bigger problem, having worked with WHO, is that girls of 12 and 13 are giving birth because they're married off, and then they die in childbirth. The next girl is the same age, and so there's a fundamental problem in the structure of the community that there's no way a hospital for women and children is going to salvage. And so as I went through that, we also had a woman minister for health at the time. She was very proactive. As soon as this became clear, she was removed. So you realise that when you're working in this sort of work on a one-off, it has to be. So when I was working with emergency architects, we worked in Solomon Islands after the disaster. They had a tsunami, earthquake, and it was, 35 people died. They actually happened to be Gilbertese, who were brought in by the English to look after the cows, and because why anyone would bring cows to Solomon Islands, I don't know, but by the time I got there they were gone. But the Gilbertese had never been in an earthquake zone, and they did this normal response. They saw the fish flapping in the water before the tsunami arrived, and so they were all killed. The locals all know what a tsunami, the sort of earthquake it is, and how they react to the tsunami, and so there were no deaths amongst them. But they lost a lot of schools, and their houses weren't destroyed because they were still building in traditional methods. Their houses just leaned over. So we decided it wasn't a reconstruction program for the housing, it was really just saying, this is what you do. The only big problem we had there was that the buildings were built out of asbestos because the British brought in asbestos, and then the issue was, how do you undo the colonialism that there was? Tell the people to go back to the original tied buildings because they were earthquake resistant, and that was not something we brought with us as architects. We just said, you know how to do this, you do it, you know, we don't have to be there to do it for you. We can provide you with tackles and blocks, we can provide you with those various issues, but you can do it yourself. With a school program, going back to a bigger issue, we went to, luckily EU Stabics were working and giving capacity building to the Department of Education. You cannot work in a country, which is what I object to with some of the stuff that EA is doing, that Architects Without Frontiers is doing, unless you get involved in the whole, say, education program. You can't just come and do piecemeal renovations to little buildings here and there. That's when you do get antagonisms between villages. Why them and not us, that sort of thing. And we said there, if you want us to come in and do pro bono or NGO work here in the Department of Education, we will do prototypes of the type of buildings you've lost. Then we can then train people to build these buildings with local materials, because everybody usually sends in a prefab kit or some other nonsense. You've got these prototypes, teachers' houses, double classroom with teachers room in between. You've got all the things you lost. Each village has its own P&C, interestingly enough. They are in power, they can decide what they're wanting to replace, and they build it. And luckily, on an environmental level, the schools were actually, in those communities, everybody owns every tree. You don't sort of say, oh, I made the mistake on the first day with the P&C of saying you've got a half soccer field and all the kids are trying to share this tiny little space between them. Why don't we just knock down a few of those palm trees over there, and and they can extend the playground, because then the girls and boys can both use it. Oh no, that was a farm, so you can't do that. So, it's sort of doing this work, you learn a great deal more than you actually bring. But the program, we trained 12 master builders to put them together. The education department had to go out and do the rapid assessment, which we normally do, and in the process they knew exactly who was actually not scamming and asking for more than they actually needed, that there was a direct correlation between who needed what type of building, and that school, 110 schools were built in 18 months, because everybody locally could do it. Now that is a much better result than spending 2 years often building a building in a village, often not referring back to their traditional technologies, and not with their local materials. So, I think it's really important that this work is important. Architects can get involved, but you actually have to be aware of the political ramifications of what you're doing.
I'm very interested in some of the things that, Susan, that you raised about the complexities of, or the issue in Afghanistan of bringing in traditional ways of doing things into a kind of liberal democratic system, which is essentially the thing that we're evangelising with often with all of this work, right? We expect women to be included, right? But that's an argument we've made to ourselves, that equity is a good thing. It's not an agreement globally. And I wonder, it's very complex, the issues that you describe, much, much more complex than in architecture we typically tell ourselves the world is. You presented a whole lot of wicked problems with those simple solutions. And that's deeply refreshing for me to hear someone present the world in that way. So what my question is, how do you navigate, on a really personal level, how do you navigate these things when you're working on site, somewhere like Afghanistan?
I think you need to go in with an open mind, and I think you need to remind yourself that this is not your country, that you're basically entering another context and another society, and you also need to ask yourself what you're here to do. And I've been various factors accused by UN official whether I'm actually not pro-women, but it started when, they were using a traditional lawyer jirga, the emergency lawyer jirga in 2003, and they were, usually they come from the US, this idea, let's have 50% women. And I was asked by Mahbouba Hukukmal, the woman that was on the committee, and what I did, I'm a sociologist, I looked at the world of women's participation in political bodies. There's hardly any country in the world, certainly not the robust old democracies, like the UK or the US or, the Nordic countries, yes, but hardly anybody gets to 50%. So I even wonder why we're making requirements that we can't meet at home in our own very social infrastructure at home, or why can't we then go through the steps that potentially some of our countries have gone through. And then my question is, should we impose because we come with the money, or are we becoming facilitators to work with them, and there's different ways to bring women in, and and I wouldn't go for 50%. You could have gone with the women that were there, because in the end then you had a lot of young girls who probably couldn't contribute to the discussion, which actually then backlashes because reinforces men's opinion of women that they basically don't talk, or what they talk doesn't have any impact. I know it's controversial to see. Other things how I negotiated, is that in order to get access to talk as a woman, it's actually quite easy because you're a third sex. You're not a local woman, you're a Western woman. Once you know that you can have access to women and men alike. Dress code, I was considered fairly conservative by some Westerners. My point is, I'm not here to change dress code. I want to engage with the elders on a level of them talking to me as a person, not having certain fantasies in their mind because I wasn't covering my assets, in terms of how I dress. And that's the point again, are we here to change? Are we here to modernize or not? And that's why I think it's often when you link a modernization agenda to development or post-conflict peace building, I think you run inadvertently into problems because it becomes much more political. And you start with what there is.
How do you avoid it though, with a discipline like architecture, which is fundamentally a tool of modernity, in one sense spatializing a set of relationships that are new to do with gender equity, to do with women's role in the family, all of these things. How do you can't actually avoid it?
I don't think you're not just modernity. I mean, look at even like the physical houses that get rebuilt in Afghanistan. The old houses, which I love, they're mud constructions, they're very thick walls, they're very cool in summer, and they keep the heat in winter. Now the new infrastructure come in, and I actually have a good friend, Jolene Leslie, who's an architect. They come in, they build houses you can't heat.
Yes.
Either they're too big or too space, and you can't cool.
Yeah.
So in the end, what a family then does, even though they've got this, imposing building, they then in the winter go in one room that it can heat because it gets -20. So I actually think, while there are modern parts of architecture come in, that's the idea of learning also what is. So can't you come in and use what's there and maybe build and do the additions of where you improve it? And if it's maybe the sanitation you bring into an old mud construction. For me, it was quite disheartening how a lot of these like traditional bungalow houses were actually destroyed. Or when I went into villages, they have this really traditional old heating system where you have a heating room and then it runs it through the floors, which I thought was quite innovative, so through, again, channels, the hot air, I guess. So I'm not an architect nor an engineer, but it seemed to make sense for it, or you heated the bathroom at the same time you heated the water. I was found those traditional bathrooms much better constructed than some of the modern ones, which were where you were just cold at all times. So that's my point, is that you start what there is, and often some of the things are there for a reason.
Yeah.
And then you see what is it that you potentially could improve and over what space of time. Yeah. That's when I said, when you have these peace infrastructure of these elders council, do we need to come in and say 50% women? You start speaking to these elders about starting to bring women in and how that would best be done into these structures. It's a much slower process. Yeah. You need to take yourself back a lot more.
And I agree, you can't, it's new is not right. I mean, architects have this idea that we'll modernise them, and we're rubbish. What we're doing, what I'm doing, because Emergency Architects finished a short, a couple of years ago, for various reasons. But since then, Lawrence and I are the Northern Territory Government Architects, and we've been having student design workshops between Indonesia and Australia. Because my feeling after working in all these different places was that unless you and in the book I've written a lot about this, that you have to appreciate that 3 people have been living in a disaster area for 3,000 years, and what their solutions to a particular problem is the right solution. Now, Ken Gakuma, who I've got coming to the next one in June, he talks about weak architecture. Because if you look at the rituals of the Ise Shrine, where they rebuild it every 20 years, so there's always someone who knows how to build an earthquake-resistant structure in that community. People forget disasters within one generation, 30 years. So if you don't have someone who knows how to do it, then they lose it. What we did in the Solomon Islands when we built the structures was put thatched roofs on them. No young man under 65 knew how to do a thatched roof, even though most of the villages still had thatched roofs. And we're saying, why is it dying out? It's 10 degrees cooler in a thatched roof than a metal roof. Why the heck are you doing this, you know? So the old men were delighted because suddenly they took them seriously again, suddenly they asked them how to build these things. So what we're doing in Jogja is, I firmly believe that it's colonialist for us to go in and do something nice or right or whatever. Unless we share the information, because as I said, we learnt as much as they learnt from us, unless we share information about construction technologies. I'm a bit sick of, I don't work in universities, but universities do not train students to build anything. People came to emergency architects to go into the field to learn to build something, because as soon as they left university, they were stuck in an office doing drawings for the next 10 years. They wanted to know, how do I build something? How do I put it physically together? And so by taking them to, we're working in Bamboo in Jogja in June, and the whole idea is that you look at why is Ken Gakuma saying weak architecture? Because if you look at what happened in Vanuatu recently, the traditional buildings, which are beautiful not conical, they're actually an arched structure with just leaves over them. What happened was almost every other building, especially the concrete buildings, had the tsunami come in and wipe them out. Those buildings lost all the tops, lost all their roofs, but actually it took them less than a day to get all that thatch back, put it on top of the roof, and they had somewhere where the whole community could come in and get dry. And so you've got to look at where you are, the culture of where you are, the cultural, where the colonial period has actually destroyed a lot of the building knowledge, and that a lot of architects are now moving back, especially internationally, moving back to, especially after Sendai, where Ken Gakuma was informed. You're going back to saying, look, you know, modern technologies don't necessarily solve these problems. What is it about the old structures that actually worked, and why? And it's most sustainable to do that.
How though? Everything you're describing is incredibly interesting and rich, and of course, how though do you reconcile that with those images that we saw of the Syrian refugee camps, the emergency war situation refugee camps that are accommodating 150,000 people, and that we as a global community need to find systems which architecture can help with in that instance, where it's the temporality of what's going on is slightly different. It's not the consequence of a natural disaster, but rather a conflict situation. Where's architecture's role there? If we agree that we're dissatisfied, do we even have a right to be dissatisfied with the quality of the accommodation, when in fact the problem of temporarily housing 150,000 people in anything that resembles shelter?
Isn't that more how you plan? Isn't that like what city planners would do? It makes a livable city versus what makes a livable camp. What I understood in the camps.
Into the problem of temporality versus permanent.
I mean, I think what you have to be careful is nobody likes permanent shelters. So you actually need to almost plan a camp that doesn't look permanent but has certain structures that I think that probably maybe some innovation should come in, that you actually don't touch that temporality, because you can't, because political UNHCR won't let you do it, they won't support it, nor the host states won't, they're too afraid, that, otherwise those people stay. But then find a way to, and I know people have looked at that, even Dadaab, which is one of the largest refugee camps in the world, so to find ways to plan them, I guess as city planners would, I'm a sociologist, but to make them livable, right? And do you actually need then a permanent shelter to make it livable? As sometimes, you look at the physical, but what I have seen, it's like Sydney, which I think is a horrible planned city compared to Melbourne, for example. So the different planning that goes into that goes beyond the infrastructure, right? That construct that goes the whole, right? To have a holistic approach to it, and I think maybe that's where architects can come in. So.
Dave, I'm reluctant for you to speak too much. Dave's going to speak next week about a program you're involved with the CSIRO in developing fabrics for refugee shelters. But can you comment on that?
No, I mean, I totally agree that, and this permanency, impermanency thing, I think you're absolutely right that architects could find a way of treading that line in a way that works for everybody. Acknowledging that if you make something that the government won't support, then you didn't help anyone. And the image on the slideshow we saw, we all thought, oh wow, they're really beautiful, and of course they perform thermally much better, but if they get knocked down, they performed actually horribly. So I understand all of those. I think that sort of knowledge is extremely significant, and I agree that the actual planning, not only in the planning of the layout, because I think one of the most interesting slides was that over time that refugee layout that just clearly dissolved itself and became something else. Interestingly, it didn't quite. Sadly, in a way, I would say it didn't find a new structure that seemed to have an organizational logic that we could grow upon. It just seemed to be eroding itself, undoing its own structure. But I agree that that's definitely a place. I gave a lecture about, 5 weeks ago or something, about Alejandro Aravena, who's the elemental architect. And so his big argument is that when we intervene as architects in these not necessarily disciplinary specific problems, one of the questions we should do, and I think you're a fantastic example, is how do we bring disciplinary specific knowledge to questions that are not necessarily natural to the discipline? They're not the same things that are taught in the school. So his example, which was fantastic, is this half a house. You acknowledge, all right, the government's not giving enough for a satisfactory house, so let's build a half a house and acknowledge that the people who live in that house are incredibly motivated and actually have the skills to build the second half, and they got really great outcomes. So I'm curious, without going into the project, with CSIRO we're working on trying to use certain kinds of technologies to make very cheap, very lightweight, rapid deployment shelters for various categories of outcome. And I'm curious about, those kind of sleight of hands. Let's deliver something very quickly that can then be built upon later by the people on the ground. And I'd be extremely interested to talk to both of you about all of the complexities involved.
Well, I think that's as Northern Territory Government Architects, that's what's actually happening after the last cyclone in the Aboriginal community with kit houses. But having worked in island states like the Solomon Islands or whatever, you can't actually get a lot of tents. Having worked in Pakistan after the earthquake there in the mountains where nobody could get to them, we could work out just how many people were actually affected, but we actually ended up sending, because we knew the women were building the gabions for the Bailey bridges over the ravine, so we thought, okay, the winter's coming, it was really urgent that something happened, so we actually just flew helicopters over, dropped piles of wire down, because they knitted the wire together for the gabions. And then they put the gabions together, we could build them up. And in fact, the irony was that McAferry, it's an Italian company that makes most gabions, had no research whatsoever on how high you could build a 3 by 4 by 6 gabion. And the other thing was, how do you keep the cold air through? But you could pack it with mud. You could they had traditional flat roofs that weren't nailed to the roof, so you just put those in, and you could then grow turf on them or whatever. So you actually had a sustainable roof. But it was a question of immediately thinking naturally. That's what architects actually do best. So in those sort of emergencies, sometimes we're really useful. I'm not saying all the time, especially if we don't go with a preconceived idea that we'll put them in something wonderful, because it's not necessary. This is an emergency situation. It will keep them going through a very cold winter. And next year, and we had to have non-homogeneous fill for the gabion, so it wasn't even, we were going to use the UTS earthquake table, but it wasn't actually easy to do, because what were they going to throw into them? We couldn't actually control that. It would be rubble, that's stone, not necessarily a homogeneous fill. Earth, everything. But it was like, if like architects are great, the harder the problem, the more we really push to try and find a solution. So that's where our greatest skill is, really.
And what it just reminded me of, maybe also where you build things. That's the planning, because for example in Afghanistan, the areas which always have flooding, and basically every year it gets flooded, every year they rebuild on the same site, right? So for somebody then to go in and look at the planning of the village and say, well, if you move your house a little bit, so next time you may not be flooded, or then you build the retaining wall, you solve the problem, right? Because emergency relief often is very, as you say, short-term immediately, but then you need to link it to a long-term solution, or you're gonna come in time after time after time to do emergency.
And I mean, I'm working with Indonesia because I think they're doing some of the best work in the world on this, because Jokowi, being a socialist, was very interested in supporting rebuilding in disaster areas. So the one Tia, who came to the conference we had last year after the national awards, she's been working on the rivers in Solo and in Jogja to try and take the people whose houses are too close to the flood zone out with new housing, not old housing, brand new housing. So it's social housing, it's moved them out of the disaster zone, so you get a huge decline in deaths. The Bangladeshis have done something similar for emergency shelters. You know, it's like, where can you have the most impact and reduce deaths first? The other stuff is actually just a layer on top of that. It's the next layer. And if you want to see really good interventions, say in Mumbai, in the slums, what's his name? I think of his name is Charles Greer's son-in-law. He was asked to do toilets. They're doing 1 million toilets a year in India apparently at the moment. So he thought, well, how are we going to do this in the slums, because there's not much room, that's all. So he said, but, you know, what is it else that's missing? He went to the community, said, what's missing? The women said, oh, well, you know, we don't want toilets because we don't want any sea dust going there. So there's a modesty issue, which is in most countries. And then there was a question of how do we make them palatable, because everybody doesn't go to public toilets because they're always so horrible. So he thought, what about the old Italian system where you had to pay to go into the toilet? A tiny amount.
I heard about them, yeah.
Yeah, a tiny amount. And so they go in there, but they actually have, the person who takes the money is actually the cleaner. And upstairs they have a community centre, and he's just covered the whole building with flowers. So it says to the women, come here, it's got these big wire things all over with bougainvillea growing. It's so beautiful in the middle of a slum. It's got cleanliness, it's got someone who's responsible, it's got lighting, it's got all the things that the women needed. And there have been hundreds of them replicated now as a result, because they are something that people like. You know, and it's a small intervention, but it's actually been incredibly useful because
it gets ownership.
It's got ownership. That village looks after it. The women in particular look after it because it's been put for them there. It has disability access, which most toilets don't. So you just solve one problem with massive numbers of replication. And that's why I'm saying, in a sense, you have to, because the Mumbai Council got him in, and he worked, you know, until he'd solved the problem to that extent. So when I talk about these things, I don't say architects haven't got a great deal to contribute, but I think you have to do it through the right channels, and you never do it because you think it's a nice sentimental action to some problem, because if it is actually hard politics, and it's also has to be community approved. There has to be a very strong need for that community to have that.
What I like also very much you bring to the table is, I worked a little bit with a guy called Nimish Patel in India in a small aid project. And his own filter for whether he will do anything is whether it has the capacity to snowball. So he won't do anything once because he's like, why would I waste my time if I couldn't do something? And it sounds like that's exactly your model as well. Let's do the thing that can be replicated, not the thing that only you can do.
It's how to operate at scale, right? How to replicate things and operate at scale that have an effect.
And that's also partly the materials you use. And so going back to, this whole thing works because he's put flowers all over the outside. I mean, you know, it doesn't really matter what the internal structure is in some ways, as long as it can be kept clean. So it's not quite the way we think as architects to resolving a problem like this.
That's also a health, to increase health in the area.
Well, that was the first catalyst, but it actually grew from that into something completely different.
I think Health Habitat does a bit on that in terms of small interventions that work to those areas as well.
But it's this whole maintenance, of course, because we see in post-conflict reconstruction, you build a school, and since they're used for elections, I've actually been to lots of schools as a monitor, and it's just really sad after a few years how badly they're maintained, just because nobody took the ownership, or because it's technically from the Ministry of Education, who is one of the most corrupt ministry that doesn't maintain. And you know, if you think that you'd like to go to a school not just to learn, but because also maybe it's a good safe space, you know. So, but then it also goes to whether you build latrines, separate ones for girls, for example. So, or whether you build a wall my most favorite was the Australians built this very beautiful high school next to an army building, and they literally then had this one watch post looking straight inside the school, and I was like, why in hell did you choose that sign? So I think a lot can go as side choice. And then the question is, do you need that? Because you build a beautiful building that then later people won't send their kids into because of something like that, because it's the guys that can go up to the wall and look at the girls, and add to it, It's a beautiful school, trust me. State of the art. It's literally state of the art, had gym and everything, but then the question is, do you need the state of the art or not?
There's an interesting relationship though, isn't there, between space and its management, its issue of management and ownership. But that even happens in, it's not even an issue of disaster relief and these kind of things, but even we know now in new biomedical research buildings, new buildings where we're testing out new collective organisations, we know that those things need to be managed as people develop new etiquettes and ways of using spaces. So I think it's so really interesting.
But I mean, that's why I got involved, because I designed hospitals from the very beginning. And when you do a hospital, you have, on St Vincent's we had 80 user groups. And they were every department. And you can imagine trying to control that sort of size. Or Westmead Children's Hospital was the same. So user group engagement has been something you do in hospitals for lots of years, and it's only really since I began, but it's only really recently in other situations that they do it. So, and it's not complicated. I mean, you really let them run it in a sense and guide them, because when I arrived in Gizo to do this school, we didn't tell them we were coming, we just thought we'd have a look at the site, and we arrived and went into the meeting, and the headmistress had a loudspeaker, and she just shouted out over all the valleys and said, "We're having a meeting." And then suddenly we had about 40 people. All of them knew what they wanted. All of them wanted some schooling for their children. And, nobody, because they built it now, it's beautifully maintained. The kids were kitted out in the most beautiful uniforms. Immediately the school started. It was, absolutely astounding. In the meantime, we did all this with very little funding, mainly through EU STABICs. And in the meantime, Australian government's version of what they wanted to do was to build a jail. It was privately owned jail, and the Australian government, and this was their response to the tsunami. And when we went down to have a look, we said, "Is there a jail here in Giza?" And they said, "Oh no, there's this little shack. There was a little shack on the beach. There's this little shack, and there's only one prisoner, but we give him the key so he can go and get lunch and dinner." Because he had raped a woman in a village, and he had actually stood at the end of the wharf in case they killed him, and they brought him to Giza, and then they didn't quite know what to do with him, so I put him in a shack. There was one prisoner in the whole Western Districts, and he'd given himself up. So you sort of think, where did they get their demographics from? Where did they actually do the research on whether they actually need this $5 million prison on this island in the middle of nowhere? And you realise that the whole aid program is crazy, or is it just internal politics in the government to provide?
It's nice to have buildings you can photograph, send abroad for aid accountability, and the questions not being asked how the building is being used and whether it's being maintained, because that's usually when the attention goes. I mean, as a journalist then goes back 10 years later and says, what has happened with the building? Is it being still used or not? How is it being used? I mean, there have been schools built in Afghanistan where the military used them as bases then, which defeats the purpose. So.
But also, to be fair, the terrain that both of you have laid out is so complex. How does any one well-meaning government find a tool that's complex enough to respond in many, many different ways, with vulnerable to an electoral cycle and criticism for exactly the reasons that you're saying? So when you were laying out the conditions I think we give ourselves a really hard time about this. You lay out all of those conditions in Afghanistan, which is so complex, everything that can go wrong, from why one wouldn't choose to build a road, to get aid in. It's that simple. To have to, as a government agency providing aid, to deal with that, exposed to a critical electorate, and then have to respond to a completely different context in terms of aid relief in another part of the world. I mean, we really demand a lot of us.
Well, see, I think that's why I like, the conflict-sensitive or context-sensitive tool. It's a basic tool where you just need to do the assessment, you need to understand very basic elements. in society, what connects, what divides, what brings people together, what pushes them apart. And then you make sure that when you design your project, you don't reinforce what divides, and you don't undermine what connects. And I think part of it is that while I think it's a fairly simple tool, it's a bit labor intensive because you need to do a study, you need to actually have but I mean, the other thing, what I make the argument, we promote now this whole of government approach. So we understand that different government agencies have to bring different things into it. Why don't we do interdisciplinary? Because in the end, what we're talking about, to understand the physical with the social infrastructure or the social fabric, so to speak. So why don't we then design teams which are multidisciplinary? I mean, development, and I think humanitarian should be multidisciplinary. And I think, for me, the most exciting one would be to create a degree where you teach students, which is an interdisciplinary degree, where they understand the different elements. You know, because otherwise you learn them by default. I learned a lot by default because I see it. And also in sociology, I mean, you start to look a bit broader, but still, I think the multidisciplinary aspect is for me very, very fascinating. You know, right now I would love to talk to somebody that designs the physical infrastructure of a refugee or come something, and then contribute what I maybe can bring into it from my part of the understanding. And maybe that's what you need. You need to have teams which bring the different elements together and understand that it's complex. So you need a complex, you know, team, and it's not just a technical solution.
For example, because their people have come for economic reasons into a city, and they're actually bunched together because they're actually living off each other's expertises. So that's an economic unit. I went to the Holsham conference a couple of years ago in Mumbai. And, you know, if you look at the Indian NGOs who are working in this area, they know that the way to make these people are sending most of their money back to the villages. They don't want to move out of there. So if they don't have a permanent residence, the government keeps sending them an eviction notice. If they get 10 eviction notices, they actually can stay there. So the NGO realised that she'd give everybody's little tiny shack a number in a notional street, and then every year they would the letter would come to the address, because the reason that they weren't counted as being a formal settlement was that nobody knew who lived where. So once they'd actually standardised this in a very simple postman system, these people got 10, then they were part of Mumbai, and then the government had to build them social housing. So they built them social housing, but then they rented the social housing out because that was another stream of money going back, preferring to live where they were because the economic engagement was the really critical reason to be there. Often their own family, their elders, their children were still in the village, and they were just there for the economic vitality. And so I think, you know, we should be doing the same thing, I think, because what happens also is that they then, now the view in slum settlements is that you give the person the land they're on. The first element of any formal settlement is to actually own the land, so you can actually sell it to somebody else. Why aren't we doing that, in a sense, in refugee villages where it could drag on for 20 or 30 years.
That's the political part.
Exactly.
Because you can't, because then you would have to give them nationality, because often nationality is ownership.
Yeah, I know, but I still think it's narrow thinking in a sense.
It is on a larger scale.
A whole generation of children has grown up in that refugee camp to be...
Three generations in the case of the Palestinian camps. I mean, the reason why they're not formalising that is for the very reason that it would
But that's because it's not a technical solution, it's basically a political solution that you need to find.
Yeah. So I think, you know, we have to start thinking almost laterally like that, because we're not, the slum thing is fairly now standard. They say, well, you know, we have to give them a foot into the city. They're going to come whatever we do. And India is sort of very at one of the forefronts in that, because I remember Michael Sorkin, who sort of writes about walking to his office in 24 hours or something, he got up in the middle of this and said, you know, there is no such thing as an informal settlement. And Sheila, who's the woman who runs this NGO, just said, you have no idea, you know, you come from New York where everybody is in multi-storey buildings and stuff and thinks they own everything. You just don't have an idea of how precious a tiniest amount of land is to a person. And, you know, that's how you settle people in a city, and then they become part of the fabric of the city, and they're quite happy to be in that situation. They're there because it's an economic factor.
But it's also like what we discussed in Afghanistan, when you say ultimately you promise people land, which you can't because it's scarce. So then you maybe need to look into, you know, apartment building construction. You promise a place to live rather than a place, you know, in terms of that land is the ownership, but maybe you can have an apartment ownership, and where you build up in a way that is not too horrible, I guess, but I mean, often because it's space, you just don't have the physical space. Everybody cannot have a plot of land. So are there other solutions of living spaces?
There is in Yogyakarta, when Jokowi was the governor of Yogyakarta, he wanted to keep the waterfront land from international hoteliers, which was actually a rubbish tip, and it was 350,000 people living in this rubbish tip, and he decided to get a very young company of architects with their headquarters in Rotterdam, Stuttgart and Jakarta, who worked on community consultation with the fishermen to keep them there. They had, all the architects came together, and they actually had a discussion with the local people, and decided to build 6-storey kampungs, remediate the rubbish tip as they went, build fishing co-ops, fishing markets, everything else for infrastructure for those communities. On the top they put all the fish drying, which is what the fishermen do there, so it stinks like you wouldn't believe, and also hydroponic farming on the roof, and then within that they did you couldn't get away with the codes here, but they put a spiral access throughout where the fishermen could sit in the middle and do all their nets together, etc. So they kept each community together. It's a really brilliant program. 350, that's bigger than the Northern Territory, which is why I was interested. More people than the Northern Territory. And they were solving this problem. It's being built as we speak. The fishing boats are still there. That's what the tourists want to see on the riverfront. So they just, because they had the political will there, they were able to do an extraordinary project.
It's political will.
Yeah, and that was because he was a socialist. He wanted them to stay there. He said, who's going to come to Jakarta if there's no fishermen here anymore?
Yeah.
It's like,
Just to bring it to a close, I think just one more question I have, a budding question to ask in terms of all these courses and I guess studios that are running across architecture schools in Australia on how humanitarian architecture should be taught. You mentioned something on the multidisciplinary line and involving the social structure side of it, and you were commenting before on, I think it was RMIT, and how they run online courses and how you feel like that.
University of Newcastle ran. Yeah, they ran online humanitarian action in architecture course, which got two online people, and that's it. They're now starting an affiliated UN course at Newcastle on humanitarian action, so that should be starting next year sometime. But I mean, suddenly, because of that huge grant to the University of New South Wales, suddenly this is on everybody's radar. I have spent since 2001 trying to get it taken seriously. The Institute wouldn't even take it seriously. We couldn't get an institute agreement with the EAA till the year before we closed. And even then, when they had an emergency, they got the money for the Red Cross. They didn't give it to the architects. So it is not taken seriously. So that's what you're taking on.
But to be fair, I'm going to be really critical about the speaker and who's not in the room. But if that's the kind of response that architecture is giving, and this is not a criticism of your work, because I haven't seen it. I'd love
get a copy of that.
Looking at it.
If that's the architecture without frontiers, if that's the work that they're offering, then I think we all agree it's not working in complex enough political environments at a scale that can do what we need it to do, and it's not good enough.
That's why I left, and it really, I felt, and have put a lot of work into starting the branch in New South Wales, but I just felt that ultimately you have to have a responsive NGO. That is still run through a university, so it's not an NGO, it's actually run for the betterment of the university. That's fine for the people involved, but it's not actually fine for the people they want to help. You have to have an independent NGO, and even then I've decided that it's better to train students with students, because they're the future, and students learning about materials and material supplies and construction and understanding each other's cultures and being able to do the work
and go then and work locally,
and go then and do locally, because it is an arrogance for us to go to the Solomons or wherever we might have gone and have to have a translator every time we go because we can't speak the language. And I just think, the work going on in Indonesia is amazing, really amazing.
Also South,
and we know nothing about it. It's like the students have been astounded by the work they're doing there. And they're rebuilding out of used materials, they're rebuilding out of composite bamboos, they're all sustainable materials.
We need to
be amazing.
Thank you so much for being part of it today.
Did you, Doc? Can I ask everyone to just